Good evening to all from India. This is Abhivardhan from Global Law Assembly, and we are live for the sixth episode of the season 2 of Global Hint. In this episode, we are going to discuss a very interesting book by honorable speaker who is with us, Manoj Kemalmani sir. So, namaste sir, having to have you. I'd like to introduce you also to the viewers, in case the viewers do not know. So, Manoj ji is a fellow in China studies at the Takshashila Institution. His research, if you have followed his newsletter, you will see that he generally focuses on Chinese politics, foreign policy, and the approaches to new technologies. And his approach to China has been very nuanced and very direct in the sense that how the CCP and its functionaries work, how the Chinese people react to things. And that's why I was very much intrigued to read his book, uh, which actually made me think that I should invite him. So his book entitled Smokeless War, China's Quest for Geopolitical Dominance is something which people should read, considering the rise of the CCP and considering because if I remember the preface, he has mentioned explicitly that it's about the issue of how China has been gaining its shape as a power and how its relevance has grown so far. So therein, I find his work exceedingly amusing, and I was thinking to have a discussion on this. Let's see how much we dehyphenate it, and I have tried to align in the best way possible to ask questions of credible nature. So, Manoji, welcome to Global Hint. My very basic question that I would have is, what did inspire you to write the book? If you can explain in a bit detail.
Right. Abhivardhan, firstly, thank you so much for having me. And it's really kind of you to give me that sort of an introduction. And thank you so much for reading the book. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. Usually when people talk about why they sort of started to write a particular book, they usually sort of have, there's usually a very deep explanation. In my case, I don't have a very deep explanation. I've been tracking China for the last few years, 3-4 years, regularly, specifically after I came back from China, having spent 5 years in the country. And if I was to sort of dig deep and search for a deep explanation, it probably lies in the broad work that I do, which is that my sense once I returned to India from China was that there's really very little understanding in India about China, despite us being neighbors. Even our reportage of China, barring a few sort of tiny oasis of good reportage in a few newspapers with a few journalists. It's really quite jaundiced, and it's counterproductive because it's quite jaundiced. And my hope was that, to try and at least have some sort of nuance in the conversation, to try and have some sort of detail in the conversation, and to try and sort of shape public discourse, which is beyond just, enemy or friend or perfidy and those sorts of things. It's more about, let's try and understand what's happening in that country and why is it happening. So that's been the bulk of my work. In that context, when the pandemic hit last year, I'd sort of done research and I'd done teaching on China. And when the pandemic hit last year, sort of about till about April 2020, obviously these were extraordinary events that were taking place. And for not just in sort of Wuhan and China, but also then in India and everywhere else in the world. And I remember sort of reading, and I say this in the book, I remember reading the cover of The Economist, and the question was, is China winning? And when I looked at the piece, my sort of first point of thought was, well, what does winning imply? And why are we looking at this in a winning and losing sort of context? And that was the idea that, obviously by that time, Wuhan was reopening and things were changing. To me, it was just a fascinating turn of events that was taking place. And it was a great moment to sort of sit back and reflect on all the things that I had learned and that I had sort of thought through, and all the things that were taking place right now, and to see what frameworks make sense of all what's happening. And can what's happening and can the frameworks that I have sort of looked at to make sense of what's happening, can it tell me a little bit about where are we likely to go? So that was what sort of inspired writing the book. The more sort of regular task of writing the book was not very difficult, because I do a very detailed newsletter every week called Eye on China. And as sort of the newsletter has grown, it was very easy for me to sort of go back to it and to sort of look at current events, because I was anyway documenting them every week, to sort of then plug into what's happening. and then bring theoretical frameworks that I had studied into sort of analyzing current events. So that wasn't as difficult as one might imagine, because I was anyway so attuned to doing that for a couple of years now. But yeah, but that's how the process went about.
That's really interesting to know, and I must say it's a very dehyphenated way of understanding, because I have mostly heard from people that this particular turning point, quote unquote, excited them to write this book particularly. So I think there are people, of course, who might not be intrigued by that, but of course it's a good way to start with, and of course this discussion and the book. So my first question after this, which is related to the book, is that I was reading about you know the Xi Jinping approach to global governance, and the Xi Jinping approach to, I would say, not global governance, let's say Chinese governance, how he's governing China. Uh, he says that there should be consolidation and expanding the mainstream ideology and public opinion to wage a magnificent struggle with historical characteristics. Uh, I'm actually particularly quoting it from your book. So my question was from a perspective that people call that the Deng Xiaoping regime had a better neoliberal or whatsoever outlook of economic growth and the way whatsoever rights the Chinese government recognizes of their own people, especially the way they treat Hong Kong, Shanghai, and other places. So, of course, there was some transition from the Deng Xiaoping times to the Xi Jinping times. Do you see the transition in a very, I would say, rushed way, or since 2013? I think since 2011, Xi Jinping got relevance. He became the vice president of the CCPA, if I'm right, and then he became the chairman of the, I would say, vice chairman of vice president. I may be wrong in the terminology, but you know what I mean. So. How do you see the transition from then shopping to Xi Jinping? Of course, some premiers came in. Minister Jaishankar, if I remember, External Affairs Minister Jaishankar often states that the 16th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party was very, very instrumental in that, because he was at that time in China. So, how do you see the transition from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping? And of course, if I would have any follow-ups on that, I would give.
Sure, sure. I mean, so to sort of get to that transition, I actually would want to recommend that people read a really good new book by Joseph Smith, which I am currently reading, and I'm sort of three-fourths through it. And I think that does this, that covers this entire span of time that you're talking about really, really beautifully, in intricate detail, talking about elite politics. But obviously, it talks about one component of it, elite politics. But for somebody who's interested, I would really recommend that book. So, to my reading of what's happened is that, look, Deng Xiaoping was a product of his time. He was a product of the party's revolutionary history. He was obviously somebody who fought alongside Mao. He was obviously somebody who'd governed alongside Mao, and he'd obviously been somebody who'd suffered along, at the hands of Mao also. So Deng Xiaoping was shaped by his experiences, and also as time came, as he sort of returned to sort of power in the mid to late 70s, there was deep contest that he had to compete with to assume that position of power that he eventually got. So that's the first point to take away, that in some senses, the nature of the party and sort of that elite friction that takes place within the party it has continued. So today, when we see Xi Jinping being ruthless in his anti-corruption campaign, and we talk about taking out enemies and this and that, and in some ways that there is a continuity. Deng Xiaoping was no sage institutionalizing the party. He was also a product of the party who was trying to shape the party in a vision that he thought was sustainable, particularly after having dealt with the horrors of the Cultural Revolution. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he was this liberal institutionalist who believed that you should have structural institutions. It's about what works and what serves the immediate needs. So if I was to quote him, I would say, even when it came to the party structure and succession and all of that, Deng Xiaoping did follow his own maxim, where he said it doesn't matter, if the cat is black or white till it catches the mice. So at the end of the day, pragmatism was far more important than anything else. So that's the first thing, and I think there's a continuity in that sense, that elite politics is still very fractious and very difficult. In terms of economic policies, look, again, Deng Xiaoping was a product of his times. He very early on, I mean, there's evidence to tell you that in the 50s there was a recognition that the Great Leap Forward wasn't going anywhere. It was actually causing much more damage than, and history has obviously borne out that it caused tremendous damage. History has borne out that the economic policies that Mao Zedong was following were not beneficial from a long-term point of view, and reform was needed. Again, by the time Deng Xiaoping sort of proposed economic reform had started even when Mao was alive, towards the fag end of his life. But it had to happen subsequently. There was a contest with regard to economic reform. And interestingly, when Deng Xiaoping also proposed economic reform, he did it in a sort of Maoist framework. So the phrase seeking truth from facts was a Mao phrase. It was not a Deng Xiaoping phrase in that sense. So he had to refer back to Mao Zedong's ideas to make the claim that he was making. And through the 80s and till the Southern Tour in 1992, economic policies were a matter of deep friction. Subsequently also, of course, but at that point of time, till 1992, it was at least a serious point of contention for many, many reasons. After 1992, at least the direction became far more clearer, although yes, policy issues created lots of friction. Now, by the time Xi Jinping has come to power, what starts to happen, and Xi Jinping enters the Politburo Standing Committee in 2007 as the vice president. And then in 2012, at the 18th Party Congress, he takes over as general secretary of the party, and subsequently in 2013 March as the president of China. By that time, what started to happen is that under the Hu Jintao regime, there's a slight shift that's taking place in terms of economic approach and economic ideology. Hu Jintao is far more populist in his approach. He's looking at sort of inequality. He's looking at regional imbalances, and he's talking about trying to address those too, as opposed to looking at breakneck growth. He's not necessarily, that's not what's driving him. Now, by the time Xi Jinping has come to power, he's also inheriting. So I'm pointing this out to just basically say that, look, it's not like Xi Jinping coming to power meant a radical break from the economic policies that were being followed. A populism of a certain kind of sort of, the new left kind was gaining ground, and it was gaining ground officially also. By the time Xi Jinping comes to power, and there are these sort of policy contests that are going on in the party, which unfortunately I think we in India don't tend to understand as much. And I think it's important for us to focus more on that, because it tells you two things. Firstly, that there is politics in the Communist Party of China, and there is deep politics. So it's not just that it's a unitary system where there is no politics, and therefore we should blame democracy in India because there's too much politics or too much democracy. And the second thing that it tells you is that Communist Party leaders are not grand strategic visionaries who look 50 years into the future and plan for the future and all of that. Of course, they do that, but there is tremendous policy contestation that takes place in that space. And there's contestation, there's luck and all of that. So anyway, the point was that Xi Jinping represented a certain degree of continuities. Yet the kind of reform that he's talking about, in his sense, it required him, because obviously he comes to power in 2012 without really a mass base. He's sort of seen as a compromise candidate between different factions. So he comes to power with an opportunity to cultivate a mass base, along with this sense within the party. And I talk about this in the book also, very briefly though, that there's a sense within the party about an erosion of the party's relevance to broader society, because ideology has certainly eroded, particularly after, because of all the economic growth, because of, when Jiang Zemin puts his theory of the three represents in place, he allows the private sector in the party. So ideology is eroding. The party doesn't have necessarily social relevance. And Xi Jinping comes in sort of that atmosphere. And when he's about to take power at the 18th Party Congress, Hu Jintao's speech at the Congress essentially talks about corruption being an existential threat to the party. So there's a lot more going on, So when he takes power, the understanding is that, and at least in hindsight, at least what we can see is that he probably had a mandate to do the kind of things that he was doing. But how far he went with that is probably not something that everybody wanted him to do. And he's sort of realized. And again, it's a tricky thing, right? So when you're going down the rabbit hole and you're trying to deal with corruption at the highest levels, you can't do it in a half-baked manner, because then it leaves you open to tremendous number of attacks. So I think there's a bargain that he's made over there, along with obviously everybody once in power likes consolidating power further. So there's a lot of that going on. His economic policies today clearly represent sort of this idea of embracing that new left vision. And I don't mean new left in terms of the radical sort of Maoist left. I mean new left in the sense that he's talking about inequality. He's talking about workers' rights. He's talking about environment, which is very different from say the past, where the idea was, okay, there's environmental damage, but we need to continue to grow economically. And I think this became clear in 2017 when he sort of reworked the so-called principal contradiction, when he said that we just no longer need high growth, we need high quality growth. So in that sense, if you look at it, there are tremendous continuities in how the party has functioned. And those continuities have come amid deep political contestation. So that's how I'd look at from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping.
Yeah, that's really interesting to state because I remember that certain authors had written about the way Xi Jinping um, curbed on the corruption and, of course, the actors who were not in favor of whatsoever he was proposing of. And that is something which is not a straight line because there are various dynamics and, of course, the way they wish to govern and constitute whatever they wish to. So, with it, I have another question to make up since I have it. So, you quote Nadej Roland, if I'm pronouncing correctly. So Nadej Roland, he criticizes basically in a good, I would say he gives a critical appreciation on Huan Yan, and he says that because this is in your chapter on discourse power, he says that the aspect of Huan Yan, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, it is much better than Joseph Nye Jr.'s soft power. So, considering on the aspects of three kinds of uh, sets of confidence or aspects of confidence which Xi Jinping, of course, focused on in the past, how do you see Roland's criticism or Roland's comparison of Joseph Nye Jr.'s American conception of soft power and the conception of Huan Yan in China? So, if you can explain about that, because I found it very interesting and maybe I would be very happy to hear from you.
Yeah, I mean, the term Huayuchan, it's essentially, it's a broader term. It means, the sort of straightforward translation is the right to speak. And you need to think of what does right to speak mean. And here's the idea that Mr. Lan talks about. And she has done a tremendous amount of work on this. And it was wonderful to actually sort of get her feedback also on when I sort of finished the book and I sort of sent it to her for her thoughts. She's done tremendous work on this, and the idea is this, right? You're looking at the world and you're saying that soft power. Let me just sort of deconstruct soft power. So soft power, in terms of what Joseph Nye had talked about, was this idea that a state has a certain attractiveness, and that attractiveness or that persuasion because of that attractiveness ends up molding behaviors of other actors. So, for example, when I grew up in the 90s, I watched a lot of Friends, and I have an affinity with New York because I watched so much Friends. Although I haven't been to the city ever, but I have an affinity. I sort of feel this sense of commonplace with the city. And that's soft power, right? There's a certain attractiveness. Most of us who probably grew up in the 90s in urban India probably watched Friends. And if we watched Friends, it was not just the city, but it was also the kind of lifestyles, and the kind of life conflicts. And you feel a sort of, as you grow up. So, and that culture essentially, you sort of start to feel comfortable with. The idea that, in India, that suddenly that culture of, I need a job and every job is fine and those sorts of things. So I think that that's one part of it. That there's a certain soft power. There's a certain soft power about American culture through music, through movies, Hollywood, and all of that. And that's soft power. There's a certain innate attractiveness, or even if the idea that one of the best ideas of soft power is this: when Barack Obama was elected the American president, headlines in India were, can India find its own Obama? Now, nobody ever writes headlines in India saying, can you find your own Xi Jinping? Right? And that's because there's a certain attractiveness of that system and of that structure, which you feel like you want to replicate in some way.
I remember. Sure. So sorry to intrude. Just wanting to add, since you mentioned Obama, when in 2017 Macron was also elected from France, people were there, maybe studying in the media that, what, we need a Macron in India. So yeah, now you can go.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, so that's cultural sort of affinity that you create, right? And to me, that's soft power in some ways, where there's a certain attractiveness, and that attractiveness sort of shapes your thinking, and then maybe potentially your decision making. It makes you far more predisposed uh, to that country, or to that people. Now, discourse power is a little bit broader than that. It's not just about attractiveness. It's actually about being able to shape discourse. Part of that is obviously, this attractiveness is shaped by discourse, whether it's media, whether it's, where a country spends, how a country talks about itself, how a country presents itself. Part of it is that. Part of it is also about being able to shape global governance norms, because that's what's going to give you greater power. So, firstly, being at the table, at the table when sort of norms are being discussed. So if you are at the table, and in the book I talk about how over a period of time you've seen China and the Communist Party making a push to be far more relevant at the United Nations, in different agencies of the United Nations. There's a real purpose for that. The purpose is that you can then shape norms of global governance. Because if you're not at the table, firstly, you can't do that. So that's one part of it, that you want to be able to shape norms. Now, why do you want to be able to shape norms? You want to be able to shape norms fundamentally because while you may have power at one level, which is your hard power, economic power, and the rest of it, when you are able to shape norms, you can create legitimacy and then subsequently authority for yourself. So there is a reason why today we take certain rights, or we believe in our head that certain rights like free speech is universal or should be universal. In India, we make the argument about free speech, although the First Amendment of the Indian Constitution is very different from the First Amendment of the American Constitution. It's completely contrary. Yet, that sort of concept is in your head, and the idea of free speech of a certain kind is very, very sort of significant in our heads. And that's basically because there's a certain value that's become attached to that particular norm, that this is how rights should be, this is how rights should be interpreted. And that's underpinned by American power. If it wasn't underpinned by American power, the right would not have that legitimacy. And that right having that legitimacy gives the United States a certain kind of authority in the global commons. So I think that's what the Chinese are talking about, where they're saying that we need to be able to be in a position where you firstly have the power and the status and the sort of positions where you can shape events and shape norms. And then you need to be able to do that, which are conducive to yourself and which promote your sort of position, so that your positions acquire a certain degree of authority and legitimacy and then authority. So that's where I sort of see the concept of discourse power being far broader than the concept of soft power.
So, since you mentioned discourse power, I was going to ask a question on the aspect of wolf warrior diplomacy, which is, of course, popularized after the Wuhan outbreak, and of course after the Ladakh clash. So, do you see that the aspect of wolf warrior diplomacy, or sometimes people also call it hostage diplomacy, whether it is through vaccines or whether it is through the death trap using BRI, as people claim it, it is like that. So, how do you see the perspective which is made on wolf warrior diplomacy, particularly when you talk about discourse power?
Right. So I think part of that is, and if you ask, or at least formally, what Chinese officials and media sort of say, what they will say is that, look, part of this is us being defensive, because the West is propagating a theory about China's rise being fundamentally threatening, and we're pushing back. And look, to me, the Trump administration did a tremendous service to this kind of approach from Beijing also, because when you've peddled such tremendous lies, and you've done so much to discredit your own media, it makes it easier for China to push back, right? If your credibility is not beyond reproach, then obviously it's easier to sort of push back and say some of these things. So I think, and then those are lessons that, I mean, not just the United States, but the rest of us also need to learn, even in India and elsewhere. But I mean, I see this wolf warrior diplomacy business as, indeed, it is partly defensive. You do feel, they do feel that they are under siege from many different directions, but it's also a certain assertiveness because you feel that you deserve more respect than you're getting. And that's because, and this is the argument that they make, right? That the Chinese officials and media and so on and so forth make, that, look, we are a major power. We contribute tremendously to the United Nations. We contribute tremendously to the global economy. We are engaged in diplomatic conversations around the world. We're a permanent member of the Security Council and so on and so forth. Why should we not get the kind of respect? And why should our system not get the kind of respect when it has delivered? So there's a certain sense of confidence, and dare I say even hubris, which is driving this. And that's coupled with a certain sense of insecurity with regard to what they seem to believe as a gradual sort of movement towards containment. I guess the pandemic has sort of hastened that process also of countries coming around because of obviously China's actions. China, I mean, it's not like it's happened organically. There's an action and there's a reaction. But I think that, and I don't think that introspection is really taking place. Or even if that introspection has taken place, from the latest speech that Xi Jinping gave at the Central Party School earlier this week, it seems like he's basically saying that this contestation is inevitable. So we might as well, and there is nothing that we can do to really sort of stop it. So we might as well accept the trade-off, and we might as well compete. So my sense is that that's what he's trying to sort of, over the last few years, that's where things have been going. So every time there's a speech where, Xi Jinping says something like, let's try and create a lovable China. I mean, this happened a couple of months ago, and the media sort of covered it as. I mean, if you read the full speech, he's really not saying that. He's not saying that go out there and make people hate us, but he's basically saying, I would rather people, people should like us, of course, but because we do so many things, but I would rather people fear us than be loved. Because the international arena is not about making friends. And being nice. It's about interest. And from his point of view, China is doing significant amounts in the world, and it deserves respect. And if it's not going to get that, it's going to push back, and it's going to say things. Now, some of this is incredibly counterproductive. Like, it's incredibly counterproductive. It's incredibly violating certain basic tenets. So, for example, when you spoke about hostage diplomacy with the two Canadian gentlemen, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. Honestly, that's just horrendous. That's just absolutely horrendous what's happening. And I think Beijing needs to introspect. That's why I say I don't see that the introspection is really happening, because some of the tools being used are really, really ludicrous. But I mean, you can see where their argument is coming from. Another sort of component of this wolf warrior business, which I think a lot of times we miss, is, and I think that's fair enough that we miss it, because the Chinese system is very difficult to unpack. And even for the best of people who try to unpack it, it's still there are lots of unknowns. So nobody can genuinely ever really say that we know what's going on. But I would also look at it from the point of view of different institutions, different bureaucracies competing. And because it matters. It matters in any system, whether it's ours, whether it's theirs. Bureaucracies compete, and hierarchies are not what we think they are. So it's not like the foreign ministry in China is akin to the foreign ministry in India. In terms of the political hierarchy of policy making, the foreign ministry in China is not making policy. The foreign ministry in China is implementing policy. The policy is made at a higher level within the party. So it's, there's a different contest that's going on for relevance, for space, for narrative, for trying to essentially state what you think the leader wants you to do. Because like I said, Xi Jinping once talks about a lovable China, but once he talks about having fighting spirit and never yielding an inch when it comes to matter of sovereignty. These are difficult messages to understand and interpret and then to put into action, right? So when you look at what's happened in the bureaucracy from the point of view of who's been promoted, it sets incentives for others who see what works. Another, and I thought this has been fascinating, and I'll stop with that comment, is that if you look at how over a period of the last few months, you will see that the narrative with regard to the origins of COVID-19 and the contestation of that with the United States, the sort of misinformation campaign that was run by, it started a year and a half ago from social media and then sort of got mainstreamed by Zhao Liqian when he sort of tweeted in March 2020 that, Fort Detrick and those sort of things. Um, the people daily so far in the last few months had not really talked about Fort Detrick, invest that and investigate there, and the US should open up to investigation. It was pushing back, but it didn't take that narrative. Yet in the last month and a half or so, it has. It tells me that the propaganda department is which is supposed to be running some of this stuff. It seems like the tail's beginning to wag the dog when it comes to that system. And I think it's important for us to try and break these things down and see also what's happening bureaucratically, because that may tell us more about which interests are at play and why certain narratives come out.
I was going to ask on the origins of the COVID-19 controversy, but of course you gave some insights on that. And anyways, so one follow-up more, and then I'll get to go to the next question. So I've read Bruno Mackay's work on Eurasia and the way he describes about the contestation between the West and the East. So Bruno says that it is the East, which is represented by civilizations like India, Japan, Korea, China, and so on in the Southeast Asia and so forth in the Indo-Pacific. He does not say Indo-Pacific. I am saying Indo-Pacific, so I'm putting the box bracket there. He because of course the Indo-Pacific can be anything. It stands from Madagascar, like Suez Canal, to anything. Now he says for Europe that, and this is something which I also find interesting when in Aurobindo when describes Asian civilizations, is that the Europeans are more focused on modernizing in the linear way howsoever they wish to, and not just Europeans, the whole West, the conception of the West. This is something which he has discussed, and even he pointed out in his book that even I would say Nobel Prize laureate Rabindranath Tagore also pointed out that whenever there's a contestation between European ideas and Asian ideas, it's not between European and Asian people, but it is more between European and Asian machines. Now, machine can be anything: government,
Yeah.
way of life, health, economy, what strategy, rule of law, principles, how human rights is understood. Because we know that there is something called the Bangkok Declaration of 1993, of course, having sponsors from many Western countries. And even Samuel Huntington points out about this diversion. So, as whatever you have discussed about Wolf Water diplomacy and the way discourse power works, uh, do you see that China is trying to create sort of an Asian machine or a machination? Because even I remember in many people, including the foreign minister, the external affairs minister of India, S. Jaishankar, agree with this. He has written in this book, The India Way. It's not what I'm saying. He has written this, that China masters the art of dissimulation. So when you say that, China has this strategy to build castles, and it's a very complex structure. It's not exactly as we see. We have a Westminster form of government in India. We have an Indian civil service inspired by the British Raj. We don't have the system like that in China. In the China system, it's very different. So even in cybersecurity, they do that. So how do you see this dissimulation? And do you see that they are forming an Asian machination of their own sort? Of course, it doesn't matter if countries are agreeing with it, because there can be trends that in future India and other countries might not agree, but indirectly aspire from those trends. Because at least I know for a fact that in cybersecurity, Western countries in India and some Asian countries are trying to ally with the cybersecurity considerations, the structure of how securitization should be done with the Chinese, which is very ironic to state, considering the fact
Yeah.
that they want to be, China repulsive, which is fine, but still. So, what do you think?
Interesting question. I mean, look, my sense is that the Asian values narrative. I mean, you've heard this from Xi Jinping, right? You've heard this before, whether it's from a security point of view when he sort of spoke about a new security concept, or whether even specifically about Asian values, he's spoken about it. I mean, I think that in the last couple of months, when we've had meetings between the Chinese foreign minister and his counterparts from ASEAN, he has spoken about things like, we need to have an Asian values framework and things like that. So, but I'm not necessarily certain it's if the political sort of capital that is required to come to sort of create that framework is something that the Chinese are willing to expend. I think what they're basically saying when they're saying Asian values, because let's be honest, right? While you may club all these civilizations into Asia, they are very distinct in some ways. There are certain commonalities, but our historical experiences have been different. So if you just look at Korea today, and let's just look at South Korea and China, there will be certain sort of cultural similarities, but they are the evolution is very different. um, you know, and I'm not the kind who would say that, because I mean, some of these, like again in the book, I quote at least one or two commentators who talk about culture being a determinant of why the West has not been able to contain the pandemic effectively, whereas Asia has been able to contain the pandemic effectively, and that has to do with sort of Asian culture of which prioritizes collective action over individual rights and so on and so forth. Um, um, Perhaps, but I don't sort of see that particularly. I think there are far more many factors. Yes, I mean, individualism gone astray has a role to play in it, but I don't think that's a key determinant. But again, I'm not in a position to sort of make that judgment that culture was a key determinant in that. So my sense is that look, culture varies, and because culture evolves. So while you may go back to sort of some commonalities, the evolution of Japan, of Korea, of India, of China, and if you look at Asia as proper Asia, large parts of the West Asia, Middle East, culture is very different. So I don't necessarily think that you can come up with certain commonalities in terms of that. Or at least I think that it will require tremendous political capital to come up with certain base understandings. And some often when you come up with some of these very basic understandings across such a diverse sort of ecosystem, what you may end up with is something that is very generic that suits everybody. And that sort of is far more malleable. So that's the first point. That I mean, I don't necessarily think that they are interested in sort of doing that actively. What I think they are interested in doing is this: they are interested in saying that there are certain values which the West has propagated, which have become quote unquote universal. Whether those are about freedom of press, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly in certain situations, and the fact that those, or the freedom to express dissent in a certain way. Um, you know, Now at a certain philosophical level, most Indians will agree that there should be freedom of dissent, right? I should be able to dissent from the state if I don't agree with something. I should be able to say I don't agree with it, and here's why I don't agree with it. But how do I express that dissent? In the West, in America, I may be able to burn an American flag. Here, I can't. So that's how we interpret it very differently. And I think those levels of conversation matter. So I think the Chinese are basically saying this, that they are saying that there are certain things that the West has said are universal, and it is making that point, and it is doing that with a political and ideological motive in mind. And that political and ideological motive from their narrow prism, from the Communist Party's narrow prism, is to contain China and to destabilize the rule of the Communist Party. Now, to push back against that effort, the Chinese will partner with whoever and would want to build as broad-based a coalition as possible. The most effective that it has been in at least that meta narrative is with the Russians, where soon after the Anchorage dialogue earlier this year in sort of late March, you had the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov visiting China, and they came up with a lengthy statement which talked about a values framework. And they put together a certain set of values that I can't recall all of them, but they were basically, if you read them, what you will see is that those are not necessarily statements about values that you're propagating. Those are essentially statements about, they come from a point of negating what the West is arguing, as opposed to you're building something and saying, this is how the world ought to be. You're predominantly saying, this is how it not ought to be. And this is not universal. This universal is constantly in quote unquote sort of. So And I think that's what they're interested in doing. So therefore, I don't necessarily think that even in India we need to buy the argument of Asian values that the Chinese make it to us, because let's be honest, they're not really worried about that. They're interested. Their interest is predominantly their own, and that's what they're trying to do. In that, if you have willing partners, it's great because it allows them to push back at places like the United Nations. When there is criticism, say with regard to uh, Chinese policies in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, cyber affairs, and so on and so forth, you can push back by saying, "Well, you had 30 countries issue a statement. I've got 60." And you want to sort of play that sort of a game, and you see them doing that, right? Yeah, and you see them doing that in the book I documented about human rights particularly. So my sense is that that's what they're primarily interested in at this stage. Yet I feel that as China's engagement with the world increases in depth, specifically with Chinese investments, technology companies, and so on and so forth, sort of having a far greater stake abroad, there will be export of values in terms of governance frameworks. Because let's be clear, like if today Chinese companies are going to devise a certain framework for, or if the Chinese government is going to devise a certain framework for regulation of algorithms uh, to improve worker security or things like that, or to improve content moderation or whatever, um, you will create a certain set of processes. It's very cost intensive for companies to create different processes in every different market, you know. So you will so invariably some of that will get exported. Yet how that happens is something that we need to see, and I think that's a fascinating area of sort of research for people who want to study.
Indeed, I think my question more was on understanding the contestation, which was of course discussed. But I agree that the way China says we are Asian, we have Asian values, and all of that, it's something which is more about their power competence relations, as you rightly point out with examples, and not about the real Asian values as they usually say. So I mean, if countries like Japan and India say, then of course there might be some aspects which are practical enough, and then that is fine. But I think more or there, that is a different discussion. Of course, I think one thing which comes in is that yes, too much universalization is also not okay, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that the value competition is also actually about value. It's more about the power competence dynamics. So,
I
yeah,
mean,
maybe.
let me just
Yeah.
sort of like I'm some of those who believe that there are certain things which you know are inalienable.
Of
My
course,
right
of
to be,
course.
and I think that there is a certain universality to that. Now, yes, there is culture, there is history, there is context, there is politics. All of that impacts how something like that gets interpreted in that local space. And I think I'm perfectly comfortable with that. I mean, I don't want to go around burning the Indian flag because I don't see the value of it. So I don't see the value of that as a means of protest. I would rather have a far more constructive means of protest. So I think that I agree with the idea that there has to be interpretation of certain values depending on your context, and one size will not fit all. Yet I do feel that there are certain basic sort of philosophical perspectives. The idea that the arc of society should veer towards greater individual freedom. I believe that it should veer towards greater individual freedom or greater economic freedom, greater individual freedom. That's how society should go. Does that make states irrelevant? No, because it has to be context specific, it has to be culture specific, it has to be. But that should not become an excuse for you to crack down on freedom. And increasingly, what we are seeing, and not just in India or anywhere else in China, in the West, we are also seeing this. That you're seeing, a far more constrained space, because populism is on the rise, and because you're not sort of necessarily, because of the fact that people are using these cultural arguments to try and crack down, or religious arguments to try and crack down. And I think that's something that is not necessarily healthy, and it serves if you are a strategist who's looking at the Communist Party, it serves them, right? When democratic societies and polities do this, because it's very easy for them to go back and say, and which they do increasingly far more loudly, is that there is no one model of democracy. Democracy is different, and previously the idea was there's no one model of democracy, respect our form of democracy. Now the idea is there is no one model of democracy, respect our form of democracy. Oh, and by the way, our form of democracy is truly participatory and it's actually superior to yours. So today the narrative has shifted from that to this, and a lot of that is to do with the confidence that the party feels that it enjoys, but also the erosion of some of these sort of fundamental values in democratic polities in society.
That's very interesting to actually know. So I have another question, and I think we have taken a lot of time discussing value systems per se. So I'll get on two questions together, and you can answer them together. So first is regarding a particular analysis which Maria Repnikova and Fan Keching have given, and you have mentioned that the phrase, as I quote it, authoritarian participatory persuasion 2.0, in which what the analysts say is that the targets of propaganda are made into active collaborators in the process of recreating pro party discourses online, which of course was a key strand of party state messaging in the days and weeks following the lockdown of Wuhan. So, how do you see this, and what actually made you feel interested to include this particular aspect, which was discussed by Maria Repnikova and Fan Kitching? So, you can elaborate on that. That is the first question, and the second question is more about since you're saying that the way the Chinese CCP does not show or is interested in the value system framework. One interesting thing which I also found was that you quoted or you mentioned Damien Ma and Neil Thomas from Macro Polo, who say that there's a conception that there's and since you talk about discourse power, it's a stylistic shift from the dry Marxist dialectic to the uh, so-called Hollywoodification, as
Yeah.
particularly Damien Ma and Neil Thomas have cited. So I think both of these are related questions, but not in a direct sense. I think they are, but
Yeah.
if they're not, I mean, disagreement is fine. But if you can elaborate on that, and then of course I will have my own
No,
follow-ups.
no, both of them are related. So, firstly, I mean, I've followed Maria Repnikova's work for a while. I think she's brilliant, and I huge admiration for her work. So what I sort of realized by reading what she was doing, and it was fascinating for me to read what she was doing because the book I think is called Media and Politics in China, and I read it after I returned to India after having worked in Chinese state media. And it was a fascinating read because it suddenly gave me insight into a framework to look at what exactly I was doing while I was over there. In that sense, it was fascinating. Now, this context of the authoritarian sort of participatory and persuasion model, it's quite straightforward, right? It's that, look, it's no longer just you know we're doing something for you, or censorship or things like that. It's about how authoritarian governments have developed, at least in China, but in other parts of the world also. They've developed a certain dexterity with regard to how do you use media. You no longer just try and tell people something and and make them believe it. The idea is also make them participate in what's happening, which is really smart, because at the end of the day what really starts happening is that you feel that you are part of something that's changing. So I am part of this problem that's evolving, and this is this phenomenal thing that's happened, and my story is part of this. And that makes me far more malleable in terms of my in terms of just being persuaded, but also in terms of how I criticize the government, because I feel like I'm being heard. And the Chinese Communist Party does this really, really well, increasingly. If you just go back to some of the serious tragedies that have happened, the earthquake in Sichuan and so on and so forth, you will see that they've done it really smartly. You start telling stories of people, their heroism, their courage, and so on and so forth. And again, it's not just in China. It's not just in China. If you just look at the parallel of what's happened in India over the last year and a half, the whole narrative of Corona warriors, the idea that at a certain hour, let's all come out together and light lamps and things like that. So you're being you're trying to mobilize society, and you're trying to make society part of what is an extraordinary effort in some way. So that's part of that. The other thing is also that you try to get people involved in, and again, the Chinese have done this fairly smartly over a period of time. The Communist Party has, is that you try to get people involved in sort of criticism of governance. And I'm not saying criticism of Xi Jinping, that gets censored, but criticism of local government issues. Because particularly when you look at, sitting in Beijing, how do you address? Yes, you may have passed a brilliant law about environmental protection, and you may have set standards, but if it's not happening at the local level, how do you stop it? It's not like Xi Jinping can just crack the whip and everything falls in line. That's not how the world works. So it's useful for Beijing to have people come up with details and scandals and things like that at the local level, because then the central authorities also know what's going on. And if you see in this sort of what's happened in Wuhan, that's one of the fault lines that center that partly led to the crisis in Wuhan, but it also allowed the center to sort of claim a certain degree of legitimacy, saying that look, the local officials messed up, and now we are here and we're going to clean this up, and there's a grain of truth in that. It's not that that's not entire. There's no grain of truth in that. So I think that there is some of that's at play. But I mean, if you look at, and this ties into the idea of Hollywoodization, right? The idea that if you're getting people involved and people are telling their story, you can't do it in that same top-down, boring structure of how the party tells stories. You need to innovate stories, because your goal is to not give information, but is to communicate at an emotional level with the person, so that the person feels a part of what's going on, right? And I mean, again, it's not just China. If you look across the board, television media around the world, including India, it very little bit of television appeals to, or even the internet, sort of so-called news coverage on the internet. Very little of it connects to you intellectually. It's trying to connect to you emotionally, because it's I mean, for different motives, right? Profit-driven media realizes that emotional connection is much more profitable. Where from a party leadership point of view, you're realizing that emotional connection creates the kind of bonds that creates deeper ties and deeper commitment to the party's cause, and so on and so forth. And I think that's what's happened. Along with that, obviously, as tools have evolved, the party has become far more smart in sort of using these tools. So if you look at, and I encourage people, right, just go and look at some of the documentaries that have come out from Chinese state media with regard to the pandemic. It's really, really fascinating. They've done tremendous, and when I say fascinating, I'm not talking from a point of view of an analyst and looking at the content. I'm talking about just the production value. Just the close-in shots of the doctors, the tension, the drone shots, and all of that. There's tremendous effort going into making a strong, high-quality product, which will have appeal around the world. And the story in itself is obviously phenomenal that you're selling. You're selling a story about something unexpected happening that's happened, and how people have rallied, how people have responded. All of the stories which appeal to us as human beings, whether you're an Indian, you're a Chinese, you're an American, it appeals to you as a human being to know that, that stress that a doctor goes through or has gone through over the last year and a half, doing a 20-hour shift in that hot PPE suit, is the same whether he's a Chinese doctor, an Indian doctor, an American doctor. And when you see that, it makes you feel far more. It makes you relate far more to that person, and that's the effort, right? Internationally, that's what you're cultivating, discourse power. But it's also domestically, you're creating people as parties to this thing. And the last bit on this that I would say is that when Xi Jinping celebrated, he honored people when they celebrated the victory over COVID. That process sort of in September last year, when they said that we finally contained COVID, there was an honoring sort of process of lots of people were awarded and honored. That's all that process, right? You're creating role models, heroes, and all of that. And why do you do that? You do that because it allows you to gain a certain degree of legitimacy. Or simply, if you go back and look in April last year, and I think I begin one of the chapters in the book with this. They had a national mourning. The idea that all media in China went black and white for the day. You had a picture of the Politburo 7. I think even Wang Qishan was there. So 8 Politburo Standing Committee members standing with their heads bowed. All across the country at that particular moment, you had horns and sirens blaring. Everything comes to a halt. That's political theater. And as a smart politician engages in political theater. So I don't begrudge him that. I think it's really smart to do that. But it tells you a little bit about what you're doing. Why do you do this? And I think the Communist Party has learned that, these things have value in terms of public legitimacy.
It's really interesting to say. So I have, of course, two interesting questions left to ask because it's not because of just time issues, but also because the most of what we have discussed so far shows that we have discussed the main aspects of the book. So one follow up, and I'll go to the last two questions accordingly. As a question, of course, is that you mentioned about the Hollywoodization, and that's something is which I find interesting. Now, people argue, and there's some scholars who study U.S. China in a parallel sense. They say that while China is focusing on a model, and you mentioned about the the so-called debate on collective and individual rights. While practically speaking, I think both of them matter at the same time. It's not that they are just against each other; they are just being made bullish of each other. You can't stay without a society. Society cannot stay if individuals are not conscious of what they do. So it's like that. Uh, how do you see the coordination strategy? Because even the Biden administration tried to do that when they came to power. They had a memorial, I think, at the Capitol, if I'm right, and then also they tried to show this. They are doing the same with their vaccination strategy. But honestly speaking, I do not find their strategy too much convincing. Of course, Trump's strategy was something politically different, and I don't wish to discuss that. But Biden's strategy, they tried to also show that collective sense, which is fine. That okay, fine, we are Americans, we have lost so many lives, and so forth. So, do you see that which approach seems to be more, I would say, connected with the people? So, I'm just asking for an understanding, not for the sense that okay, fine, I'm just saying okay, US is bad. No, not at no. So that's what the question is.
Right. So my sense is this, that the United States hasn't done well, and that's evident. Dealing with this pandemic, it clearly hasn't done well for more reasons than just individualism versus collectivism. I think it's not done well because of dysfunction in government, because of politics, and for many other reasons. But I mean, that's my sort of very superficial understanding. I don't study the United States, so I can't honestly sit here and say with any sense of authority. But this is my sort of sense that that they've clearly not. I mean, the fact that they've not done well is very evident. Why they've not done well, there are multiple reasons to sort of go into that. But I wouldn't sort of put it to simply individualism versus collectivism. Um, what the Biden administration has shown is that when government puts its might behind it in a far more unified manner, when sort of, because America has tremendous state capacity. And what they have shown is that when you can put that might behind it, you can actually do things very, very rapidly, which is evident in their vaccination program. That they have expanded vaccination very, very rapidly. There were some things that were very right. They were done, which were very correct. So taking the gamble on booking vaccines early and doing those sorts of things, to me, from a government point of view, that is really bold thinking and bold steps. For example, in India, we didn't do that. We didn't make that big bet early on vaccinations when vaccines were not ready. We didn't make that big bet, and there are many reasons why we didn't make that big bet. Part of those are, how governments work, but part of those are also about how bureaucracies work and what are the incentives of bureaucracies and what are the challenges that bureaucracies face. So I think that there is multiple reasons why things have worked or things have not worked, and I think we need to there needs to be a far more deeper dive to understand why the US failed initially. But I would assume government misfunction has a big role to play in it. In terms of this idea of individualism and collectivism, look, I mean, I agree with you. You obviously need both. Society can't be entirely that way. But when I say that, what I mean is that when there is conflict between individual rights, basic individual rights, fundamental individual rights, and social well-being, or whatever one may define as social well-being, uh, the arc of law and history must veer towards individual rights. And this is, again, I'm very frankly stating, this is sort of my ideological bias. And because at the end of the day, if you're going to end up in a position where you are going to, prefer, if your sort of structures are going to be built on some imagined social well-being, then you need to define what is society. And is society a select group of people, and who represents that? I think that essentially leads to this ugly Pandora's box where everybody is trying to create enough numbers to represent society. And then you start making concessions for X groups and Y groups. So then you end up in a position where it's like, oh, but if you wear that red colored hat, then my community gets offended. And if you wear the purple color hat, then my community gets offended. And, then you're like in this thing. And then what is a community? And how do you define it? So you get into all these sort of questions, which I think are really problematic. And I don't think they are. And the net effect of that is that you have a less free society, which I don't think benefits anybody. So therefore, my sort of ideological bias is that how effective a government has been has to do a lot with state capacity, identification of threat, policy implementation, all sorts of things. Perhaps culture, but I don't think culture is the predeterminant. That's again my selective bias. So that's how I would sort of examine that.
No issues. I actually my focus was only about the way they cooperated. So my question was going to
The way
about
the way
how,
the
yeah,
Chinese and the way the Chinese and the Americans cooperated.
I would say how the Chinese government tried to show their sense of cooperation towards various governments, not just the United States, but various governments. So my question was
Oh,
going to
okay.
be on that, but yeah, I actually went on
Okay, so
invasionism. So
on this notion of pandemic diplomacy, how the Chinese look. I mean, I am of the opinion that look, it's perfectly fine for China to use its manufacturing clout, its vaccine clout, and all of that to do what it's doing. It may seem, I mean, look, when we were supplying vaccines, we called it Vaccine Maitri. We supplied it, and we did our thing. So, I mean, look, at the end of the day, it's a tool in the hand. I am very amoral in that sense. Uh, I am perfectly fine with Xi Jinping putting, I mean, let's be honest. In India, when we have political campaigns and when rice is delivered, you have the politicians' photograph plastered on boxes of rice. If you're doing now, we may look at it as amoral, as immoral, as something that should not be done, whatever. But till it's not illegal, it's fine. And then in a domestic context, you may actually have laws which may actually say no to some of those things. In an international context, really there are no laws. And it's perfectly fine for a country to do this. And I'll remind you, when China was going through the lockdown of Wuhan and subsequently, uh, and I remember there were some donations that came from Japan, and there was a lovely poem that was attached to it and all of that, and became very popular on Chinese internet also. And they sort of talked about it, saying that, oh, look, this is about solidarity and support and this and that. But that's also soft power. It's exactly the same, although the way the Chinese did it, with stickers and posters and embassies and ambassadors holding handover ceremonies and all of that, frequently them sort of playing it up, them playing up the fact that, oh, look, the world is so thankful to us. A lot of that had to do with their domestic politics, where you're sort of shoring up domestic legitimacy to say that, look, we are a major power and the world is thankful to us. But it's par for the course in international relations. I look at it, like I said, very amorally, and I say it's perfectly fine. At the end of the day, you know, if some of the things that they said and they did, where they sort of undermined the European Union or they undermined the United States in what they were doing, it's important for the European Union, the United States, for India, and for others to say that we need to make our contributions that we are making far more well known publicly, because we are doing a lot more, and we are not talking about it. So we need to talk about it a lot more. And obviously, how the Chinese went about it did annoy people. So it did annoy the Europeans, specifically the members of the EU, because they felt what the Chinese were doing was undermining the EU's unity, and they were doing that. And while the Communist Party can argue that we're doing this partly for domestic sort of needs, because it shows up domestic legitimacy, it sort of obviously impacts your relationships, because how the others saw it was that, look, you're doing this and undermining us, and you're sort of eking these ugly political gains, which then leads to sort of counter reactions. And that's a loss from a Chinese point of view. So that's wasted diplomacy. So if you're thinking from a sort of strategic point of view as to whether it worked or it didn't work, Domestically, I think it really worked. It has done well. There is a sense that China played a big role in the world at the world stage and continues to play a big role. Internationally, there are pockets of frustration, irritation, backlash, which again I don't think the Chinese have adapted very well to. But for me, it's par for the course. I mean, if you have the capacity, you will flout it. It's perfectly fine. You need to think about whether it's working for you or not.
Indeed. So, with the last two questions, mostly I would ask the very last question on how the Indo Pacific construct will be, and with that, we'll end. And a little bit on Afghanistan, although I don't think so that it has that much correlation. Even if Indo Pacific is not just maritime and it's also landlocked, but still, I don't think so. But still, I have two final questions from your book. So, one I found interesting about your mention of the so called Chinese far left, notably one of them being Fang Fang, whose you mentioned that over the years, Fan Fang's work, often discomfiting for its bleak realism, has revolved around the exploration of the lives of the ordinary Wuhanese, from factory workers to intellectuals, and of course, and how she expressed about the whole situation when the COVID outbreak was going at its first in Wuhan. So that is so. The first question is how did the governor of Wuhan, let's say the Wuhan province, deal with the early days of the outbreak, not just from a point of perception building, but also from a point of how they seek their governance. And the second question, which is from your book, is regarding your mention of Andrew Nathan, who is from Columbia University. So he argued in a landmark paper, as you state, that institutionalization had played a critical role. And since he claimed that, he entailed on an increasingly norm-bound nature of the CCP's succession politics, which is like the increase in the meritocratic aspect as opposed to the factional considerations in the promotion of the political elites. So the second question is very simply quoting Andrew Nathan, is that as we not me particularly, as the certain scholars in the West or certain people in the West make a notion that okay, fine, there's a Berlin Wall moment for China being awaited, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Equating when them with the Soviets, although I don't practically see how that can happen. So,
yeah.
how do you see Andrew Nathan's criticism? So, both of these questions to you. Yeah.
Yeah, let me begin with Andrew Nathan. So in the book, I think I actually talk about Andrew Nathan and Joseph Hugh Smith and their sort of both their propositions, because Joseph Hugh Smith criticizes Andrew Nathan, not criticizes, but actually he sort of provides a counterpoint. And I find myself, and again, my thoughts on this are also evolving. So I find myself uh, far more aligned with what Joseph Hugh Smith is arguing. Institutionalization in the party is it's not something that's evolved. I mean, depending on what do you mean by institutionalization. If you think of institutionalization as clear rules that dictate conduct of power, that dictate issues like succession, that dictate issues like processes of how things how you exercise power. In some ways it's happened, but it's not necessarily taken place. And I think that the notion of institutionalization from a Western perspective or even from an Indian perspective, uh, it's not the same in China. It's not like somebody becomes the leader and then that person clearly has a defined set of roles to necessarily play, and that person plays those roles, and then he brings in their people, and there is a sort of steel frame of bureaucracy which continues sort of and while you may bring your own people that you may feel, so you will bring different ministers and this and that, or say in the United States context, you may bring, President Biden can nominate say the Secretary of State and so on and so forth, and undersecretaries and all of that, so that you can do that process. But there is a certain structure within which they operate, and there's a certain process by which they are elected, by which they are eventually confirmed and selected, and so on and so forth. It's not sort of something that happens based on uh, internal factional rivalry. There's a certain process that leads to all of this, and unless that is met, you can't do this. Now, if you go back and look at Chinese sort of succession politics, particularly, it's really again, it's fascinating that a lot of the discussion on Chinese succession has missed out and tends to forget that there were two general secretaries who nobody remembers. When we talk about party's leadership generation, people talk about Mao, Deng, Jiang, Hu, Xi, but you forget that there was a Hu Yaobang, there was a Zhao Ziyang, who were both general secretaries and who were both removed from the position of general secretaries in very short periods of time. So it was not like succession politics happened was very straightforward. Also, and I think an understudied area, because if you study how people move into the central committee, into the Politburo, and what qualifies them, who appoints them, how do you move up, how do you move down, why has retirement age changed so significantly? I mean, there was a point of time when Jiang Zemin arbitrarily brought down retirement age to 70 for members in the Politburo Standing Committee. And today we have the rule of 7 up, 8 down. That if you are 67, you can still get on the PBSC, but if you are 68, you can't. And the idea is that, well, this was an institutionalization that was taking place. Well, not necessarily, right? I mean, when Jiang Zemin gave away power in 2002 to Hu Jintao, he held on to the chair of the Central Military Commission. So I think that we've understood, in some ways, there has been an imposition of our perceptions of what institutionalization implies, where we've seen events and we fit them within our frameworks rather than try to sort of, and I mean, I don't blame people for that, because I think that it's really, really difficult, because it's such a complex environment of which there is so little information. So you will try to put them in the frameworks that are most, that are easiest for you to understand, or that make the most sense, rational sense to you. So I don't sort of, I think that scholars have tried it's been a difficult journey, but I think that it's really clear that institutionalization hasn't necessarily happened in the way we conceive it to have happened. And I don't think institutionalization is even today happening in that way. There is Xi Jinping is sort of reworking the structure completely in some ways. And I presume the next guy who comes after Xi Jinping, although nobody immediately on the horizon, will do the exact same thing that you will see. And that person will be a product of this sort of, inner elite infighting, or, desire to capture more space. So that's my sort of take on that particular thing. I find myself increasingly more towards the Joseph Hugh Smith camp, and that's why I recommend everybody to go and read his book. On the issue of Fang Fang, look, in many ways, it's really fascinating. To me, that story is fascinating, not just for the fact that she had this diary and which documented things and which was really, really beautiful prose, but it was also because, and obviously it was not just beautiful prose, but it was very courageous in that environment. The Wuhan government had clearly failed, and she was very critical of them. And the government, by the time the lockdown of Wuhan happened, it was clear that the local officials were in deep water, although some of them have been rehabilitated despite being sacked right now. What I find interesting about that story is this, and you talked about the left criticizing her, the sort of nationalistic, the uber nationalistic and the ultra left sort of coming together. And to me, that's something that's evolving in China. And it's again a space for us to study, because it's not necessary that the leadership may be comfortable with the ultra left and the uber nationalistic, but you ride that tiger because it gives you political advantages from different times. And it's a difficult game to sort of balance that sense of nationalism and take advantage of it, while making sure that it doesn't sort of go out of hand. And to me, that sort of dynamic was interesting because of what happened with Fang Fang. That if you read what she's saying, she's not criticizing the Communist Party of China. In fact, at a certain point of time, she actually says that now the central leadership is here and they have taken control, means things will get better. What else can we hope for? Because, we do. And so she's expressing a certain faith and trust in the central leadership, but she's also saying that's the thing that we do here. What else do we hope for? We hope for the best, but also I trust these guys. So she's not actually criticizing the central leadership, yet she gets pilloried by, sort of the far left and the sort of nationalistic folks who ride on that. Today, what we are seeing, just in the last couple of days, you've seen that commentary written by a Chinese former newspaper editor in China, which was now last week, which was shared across by all state media outlets, which talked about a profound revolution coming to China, and lots of other things in the context of the current crackdown that's taking place on the internet, entertainment, tech sector, and all of that, or even with regard to the economy, this notion of common prosperity. And Hu Shijin, the editor of the Global Times, has sort of been critical of it, saying, and the Global Times is as nationalistic as most things get, at least in the mainstream. And you're seeing that, he's criticizing, saying, look, we're going too far. So I think there's a bit of a, domestic sort of stuff, contestation that's going on over there, which again we don't study because we see China as a monolith, as this one big block. But there are lots of different sort of fractures and fissures which you should study. And I think the Fang Fang story to me is interesting from that point of view.
I'm glad that I put up the fun story for you. So, with this last question, which is related to the book, in the sense that the construct of the Indo-Pacific scholarly and from a diplomatic perspective is emerging. And considering the way that, of course, one end of the Indo-Pacific, mostly people used to say, even under the Trump administration, that the Quad is anti-China. Now, under the Biden administration, people have seem to have forgotten that, or maybe they are thinking of other aspects to call it out. I see it like that because they're now saying the Indo-Pacific is anti-China and not the Quad. So I find it puzzling. Either it is anti-China or either it is India-centric. Because again, within that, one problem which we see, and I realized by reading your book also to some extent, I must say I've read other works, and of course after reading your book, from a perspective that the way the Indo-Pacific construct is seen, it is usually observed that no, it's something which the Trump administration or Shinzo Abe came up with. But factually speaking, even in the Second World War and even in the earlier days when Asia had relevance in the 20th century, this concept was there. The name was not there. Even I mean, Asia Pacific is something which is more related to commerce and all of that stuff. So we all understand that shifting from Asia Pacific, which has, this is my understanding, I may be wrong, but just two main actors. First, of course, China, and second is the ASEAN countries, ASEAN member states in Southeast Asia. India has a role, but still, I believe, passive in soft power. Hard power, I have no comments because I don't work on hard power. But considering that, and this is my understanding, considering that, how do you see the China sees the Indo-Pacific construct? And with this, we can end, maybe, I would say.
Right. So, look, first and foremost, history is great, but let's be very clear: the Indo-Pacific is a geopolitical construct. It's not a geographical construct. I mean, there is a geographical construct, but essentially, when we are saying the Indo-Pacific strategy, it's not a geographic strategy; it's a geopolitical strategy. So it is a geopolitical construct, and it's so my kids finally come out running. Okay, so it is a geopolitical construct, and that's the first thing that we need to keep in mind. How it came about, there are sort of, if you go back, what you will see is that, to use the phrase Indo-Pacific happens much before Trump even comes to power. Even in India, there is the use of the phrase Indo-Pacific much before Trump comes to power. So that's, I think, something that we need to keep in mind. There's a greater interest in the Indian Ocean region politically that begins, sometime in the towards the end of the first decade of the 2000s. I think in 2008 to 2009, Robert Gates, who is the then Defense Secretary, while visiting East Asia, talks about India being the net security provider in the Indian Ocean. There's a notion that's developing, and you see the Indo-Pacific phrase being used in India a couple of times after that officially also. So the sort of construct is developing. Now, China is central to this, right? Because there are two reasons. One is not just that it's anti-China, but there is a sense that China's rise is reshaping this entire region, which is not just East Asia or the Western Pacific, but also the Indian Ocean region. And you need to have a strategy that looks at that holistically rather than individually. Because let's be honest, Chinese are looking at it holistically. So it's important to have a strategy that does that. In part to sort of look at the region much more holistically, in part to sort of remobilize, reorganize your force structures, and a host of other things, and also look at economics and trade and all of that holistically. So you see the strategy sort of evolve. Now, if you look at how the Chinese started viewing this, and there's an interesting paper which I can probably share with you later, which talks about, from 2017, their sort of interest in the concept of the Indo-Pacific begins to come up far more once the Trump administration starts to use it far more. So I think 2017, you see Donald Trump visiting East Asia, and he talks about. I actually think the first time that the phrase is used is by Rex Tillerson when he was Secretary of State in October 2017 when he's speaking about the U.S. policy with regard to India, so the U.S.-India relationship, and he uses the phrase Indo-Pacific. And then you have Trump use it during his visit to Vietnam, and he talks about again free and open Indo-Pacific. And then subsequently, you have the national security strategy, which talks about the Indo-Pacific, and which talks about China and Russia and North Korea particularly being problematic. So you see something sort of taking shape. Subsequently, you heard the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi talk about ideas that emerge like foam on the sea, which vanish. So we don't need to be particularly bothered about it. Obviously, within a matter of time, now they're talking about the Quad being Asian, NATO, or whatever, which is again, you're overplaying what's actually happening. But the fact is that subsequently the Chinese start to take it far more seriously. And there is research to show that there is an effort that goes into understanding what is it that these countries are talking about when they're saying Indo-Pacific strategy. Because look, India doesn't have an Indo-Pacific strategy document. The United States doesn't have an Indo-Pacific strategy document. So how is it that the Chinese are going to make sense of this? And while they're talking about let's work with partners and allies under the Trump administration, Trump is pulling out of the TPP. He's talking about burden sharing with South Korea, with Japan, and things like that. He's engaging India in a trade conflict. So, there's a little bit of a confusion, and the Chinese are also trying to figure this stuff out. Under the Biden administration, and I have a paper which I did earlier this year, which talked about the US's Indo-Pacific strategy under the Biden administration specifically, which I think is becoming far more clearer. Under Trump, what we saw was the focus was predominantly on security, and the Indo-Pacific was viewed from a prism of China. Under Biden, what we are seeing is that there's a broader focus on not just security, but also emerging technology, healthcare because of the pandemic, but economics, climate change. All of these issues are being talked about within the Indo-Pacific construct. I mean, the Quad working groups for vaccines, climate change, and emerging technologies are evidence of this. So I think that the strategy is more about locating China within a broader Asia strategy or a broader Indo-Pacific strategy, as opposed to locating the Indo-Pacific in a broader China strategy. So I think that sort of shift is taking place in the United States. And I think that's a positive shift from an Indian perspective, because you don't want a US that's fundamentally positioning its policies from the point of view of antagonism to China. You rather want a US that is positioning its policies from the point of view of how can we engage with the region better, benefit the region, and thereby compete with China. And I think we're seeing much more of that, which I think is a positive. So that's how I see the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific policy evolving. I'm also quite positive about, you mentioned Afghanistan, and I've written about this in one of my recent pieces, that a lot of people have been talking about how the US withdrawal from Afghanistan implies that it's the sort of death knell for the values-based approach of US foreign policy. And, Biden had put values at the heart of his foreign policy, and so on and so forth. To me, I'm perfectly happy with values-based foreign policy taking a back seat. That's not to say that I don't see some values as relevant. What I'm saying is that I would rather be far more interested in US foreign policy being driven by interests and common interests with partners and allies, as opposed to values necessarily. And I think that can be far more fruitful, and that can sort of remove certain irritants within the relationship. So I'm optimistic in that sense of India and US and their engagement with regard to just the broader engagement between the two countries, but also with regard to the potential to at least frame rules of the road for China's engagement within this broader region.
I really appreciate your analysis of how the Indo-Pacific construct is to be seen. In fact, my view aligns on the fact I am not sure about how the Biden admin is doing. They might be doing good. Of course, we see from the spirit of the Quad and, of course, the various initiatives they're trying to take. And that's a different question. We can debate that
So
afterwards.
I
But
think
yeah,
I think it's early,
yeah,
it's early days. It's early days for
yes,
how policy implementation is going to take place. Because let's be honest, there's a lot of China policy which is under review in the U.S. and it's been under review in the U.S. ever since Joe Biden came to power, and we still don't know in which direction that's going to go. So it's still early days in my view, but I am happier with the shift away from China being the center of America's Indo-Pacific policy to the Indo-Pacific and China being a part of the Indo-Pacific policy rather than China driving the Indo-Pacific policy, because those are two fundamentally different philosophical starting points. So I'm happy that the starting point has shifted. In terms of tangible outcomes of that, we still have to see. But at least for the Quad working groups, the direction in which they were set up, I am happy with that. Their outcomes we still don't know, so we need to wait on those outcomes, and I think we need to see that.
indeed. So, with this, we end this amazing discussion for Global Hint episode 6. The very reason I wanted this discussion was that people know about how the Sino approach has been when it comes to the globe, when it comes to India, when it comes to the way they work inside. And this book on the CCP is a very enlightening perspective. I recommend people to follow Manojji on Twitter. His username is the China Dude, so you can follow him, you can find him. Please also subscribe to his newsletter, if I'm right, Eyes on China. So,
Yeah.
uh, exactly. So follow the newsletter, subscribe to it. It's a very good, informative newsletter. With this, also I feel that there should be some more studies on not just China, even other countries in the way in a much sophisticated manner. So I think this podcast episode could be considered as a way to embrace that discourse and, of course, see where nuances can be necessary. It's a different question whether you have some political disagreements with China, which is perfectly fine. Which, as actually he rightly pointed out, that yeah, fine, they are trying to say something called Asian values, but it doesn't mean that Vietnam, India, or South Korea would agree with them. In fact, I believe even Vietnam is a communist regime in that sense, as people say, but Vietnam and China have never been very friendlier in that sense. So ideology or values may not matter. What matters is real interest. And the same applies for the Americans also. So with this, we end this episode, and we will come up with another episode of Global Hinge soon, maybe on something new, maybe on Afghanistan, or maybe on anything else. Within this thing, we will be coming up with a very interesting episode on Hindi Divas, on Hindi and the connectivity of Indic languages, with some exceptional experts, who I'm not going to reveal. I'll reveal details about them on Twitter. So thank you so much for being a part of Internationalism Global Podcast, and thank you so much who have watched this live session, as of course those who will Bing watch this live session. So Manojji, thank you so much for joining, and thank you so much for viewers. With this, we end the session, and so in the end, I would say stay
Thank you.
tuned as we come up with much updates.